Hi all, this is Robert Schwenker. This is Bluesky Community Voices number 5, Decentralized User Experience. Today we'll feature a number of panelists to discuss decentralized user experience. And our co-host and moderator is Manasi, and we'll get started in just one moment. We'd also like to point out that in April, the 29th, we'll have number 6 in our series on micro formats, so please stay tuned for that. So with this, I will pass it over to Rabel, who will begin framing the conversation, and he'll pass it off to Patrícia Estevão, and then we'll start the panel around 12:15 Pacific Standard Time, and then at 1 o'clock we'll begin a Q&A. With that, please welcome Rabel.
Hey, welcome everyone. This is, when we think about social media, we think about what we're building and why. And at the moment, we have a few major apps that dominate the space and have a sort of a fixed set of design patterns for how things work. But I think when we look forward to saying, okay, how do we go from the mobile apps and the web experience we have now to the future, it's useful to look back in the past. And Twitter's a great example of that, because although it was never decentralized early on, the app creation and the user experience was driven off to these third-party apps. And so what we think of as social media today, app replies, hashtags, real-time search, inline images, streaming, tweet streams, retweets, all these things were actually created by a bunch of individual app developers who were building on top of this centralized system, but they got to derive their own user experience. And that was an incredibly innovative era. And for me, one of the appeals of Bluesky is to say, okay, Twitter had this massively experimental stage early on and then became a sort of sustainable, viable company. How do we use this collective platform and the business that it is with all of these independent projects, all of these open source projects, all these independent companies and community projects, and say, okay, how do we reopen that space for people to build innovation and do it in a way that's built on a bunch of decentralized tech that didn't exist 15 years ago. We've got decentralized ledgers, we've got users being able to self-certify who they are, we've got permissionless networks, and designing for that, where your identity isn't an account on a server so much as a set of cryptographic keys that you might need to keep track of, presents a whole set of new and interesting problems. Myself, for the last few years, I've been working on a project called Planetary Social, which is an implementation of the secure scuttlebutt protocol. And it's an app that feels a bit like Twitter, but where your identity exists on your device and everything is communicated over a peer-to-peer network using a gossip protocol. And so we've been trying to figure out, okay, how do we make discovery work? How do you handle the fact that in a decentralized space, data arrives inconsistently, the same way that you might inconsistently arrive with BitTorrent. Data in a decentralized space it isn't all there and available. And what we see with something like Twitter or Instagram or TikTok is you have all the stuff in the same database in the same spot. And so you can see it all at the same time. And so the hope with Bluesky and the larger collection of these projects is that we can open up the space for innovation again and for a diversity of implementations. And that, one of the exciting parts of this is that doing this without a set of users, like you need a critical mass of users, and you need enough people to come along, and you need a way to do that. And even things like Substack and Clubhouse, all built off of the Twitter social graph because it is more open and it is a space for building platforms. And so I'm also curious, sort of, to, in some of this conversation, have a conversation of how do we build off the existing things, and how do we move forward? One last thing before I open it up is there's a lot of discussion about data, about owning your data, and I would venture to say that users' data isn't the most important thing. It's their social relationships and their connections. So, back many years ago when Chris and I and Florian and others were talking about this stuff, we talked about the social graph. And what is more important than your data is your metadata and your ability to connect to people. And so that is about saying, okay, how do we open it up to multiple clients? Who can connect to whom? What kind of data can be shared? And how do you find out where people are? Because if we just open it up flat where you can send a message to anyone else, we end up with the email spam problem. I would like to, maybe I'll hand it back to Manson and we can move forward with the conversation. Hopefully I gave a bit of context on where the problems of decentralization are coming from.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul, for setting the stage for this conversation. I think you mentioned a couple different things that I definitely want us to dig into. But before we even get started, I think I wanted to hand it off to Patrícia, who's going to continue the framing for this Twitter space.
Hey, thank you, Manasi, and thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to have this chat with this great set of people, first of all. And I think what I've tried to share with my work through my career, my professional path, as you'd like to call it, is that user experience is something that is very, very important when it comes to decentralized technologies. And it was kind of ignored for some time on this industry, sometimes for very good reasons, because you have to focus on the core technologies, you have to focus on some foundations, but ignoring it has its drawbacks. And I think this is the time, definitely, if not, definitely not too late, but I mean, it's definitely the time to start looking at user experience and how we can apply this to these technologies. Because when you have the same principles, the same core principles of design that were applied in all other types of products and all of types of projects, but those principles, they were very bent to the mindset of centralized systems and technologies. And this means that most designers who are very well trained, very good professionals, they also have this mindset of decentralized technologies. And what we need to do now is to kind of rethink all these core principles that are the same principles from all history, because design is about people. So since people stay the same, the core principles of design stay the same. But we need to think how we apply these principles of design in this new context of the decentralization. And I think this is something that we'll have the opportunity to discuss here a little bit at least. And I think it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Patrícia. I think like initial stage of any technology, there's a lot of iteration and the focus is on the technical solution, less on what the end user experience looks like. But we need to engage in those conversations if we want this technology to have mass adoption. So appreciate that framing. Thank you. Hey, everyone, if you're just joining us, this is Bluesky presents Decentralized Social Media Conversations. If you haven't joined any of the previous ones, each one has a different topic ranging from decentralized storage, identity, reputation, moderation, just the different components that go into it, building a decentralized um, public conversation protocol, which is the mission of Bluesky. And today, while we still be talking about decentralized social media, I think the context is from a user experience perspective. And what does it look like in a world where we might have multiple clients, multiple applications? What does it mean for our interactions with friends who might not be using the same client or application? And then thinking about, as more clients and applications proliferate in a decentralized social media world, what does it mean from a user empowerment, creator empowerment perspective, but balancing that with the consumer and their experience. So I'm excited to dive in today, and thank you all for joining. Before we jump into it, I would love for quick intros from our speakers here.
Manasi, do we have time for Chris Messina also to give some framing context and historical perspective for this conversation?
Love it. Yeah, let's
please.
Chris on.
Hi, everybody. I appreciate that, Rabel. It's good to see you and lots of other familiar names. I want to be careful not to, I don't know, one, either, wax too historical or I try to, let me see how I can frame my thoughts. I will say that back in the 2006 through 8 time period, there was a lot of energy and a lot of excitement and interest in decentralization. Twitter started out as largely decentralized, and it was built upon a number of protocols at the time were kind of peer-to-peer messaging protocols. It's kind of fascinating to see what's happening, today, where Europe has just passed legislation that essentially is requiring messaging apps to interoperate. It's sort of back to the future. Nonetheless, the interaction, the interfaces, the ways in which you establish trust and user comprehension and enable people to participate in what is, kind of an order of magnitude more complex environments requires, I think, starting with what the user goals are and what we're actually trying to allow people to achieve. And whether or not the current products that they use are actually not meeting their needs, and if so, in what ways. I always found coming to the world of decentralization, and I grew up in New Hampshire, and so I was somewhat like libertarian, and kind of always liked the idea of decentralization at a high level and kind of as an abstraction to be interesting unto itself. It requires kind of collaboration, coordination, and consistency amongst a number of different people who perhaps have different goals, but nonetheless agree that by creating kind of a centralized sport, if you will, where the competition happens, that innovation can occur therein. But of course, advertising kind of screwed a lot of it up, and we are where we are today. So, as a designer and as someone who was trained in design, it always kind of like rubbed me kind of, I don't want to say like the wrong way, but kind of was a friction point to explain to like how do you create the best possible user experiences and products when decentralization kind of necessarily requires a restricting of the possibilities to a, if not lowest common denominator, but a kind of like, progressively enhanced set of experiences that tend to devolve the further away from the center you get. And I haven't really come up with a solution for that. Email works because it's very straightforward. Like the protocol is very simple. We're starting to see deviations in Gmail and other types of user experience interfaces that are breaking some of those conventions and some of the standards and some of the interop to allow for that innovation to occur. And that's when we end up with this tension that sort of pendulates back and forth between centralization and decentralization. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to decentralize the social web, and we largely failed. There's a lot of lessons, I think, to learn from that era. I made a lot of mistakes. The one thing that I contributed to the social web that seemed to work, which is an example of how the lowest common denominator thing might be the only thing that works, is of course the hashtag. And it was designed not for Twitter, but for the social web in general. But it's like stupid, that it's hard to imagine kind of repeating that level of adoption in a decentralized UI paradigm, given the needs that users have today. So anyways, I won't go on anymore, but happy to provide more context and framing for some of the things that we tried, some of the experiments we worked on, and the ways that we approach this stuff. And I'm just excited that this conversation is continuing, and perhaps I'm not the kind of person that believes, well, it didn't happen before, so therefore it's not possible again. Now might be the right time, especially given everything that's going on in the world, to really take a look at these things again.
Yeah, I love that last part, Chris. While there were attempts made in the past, I think that doesn't mean, and even if they fail, that doesn't mean we cannot try it again and it might not succeed. So we appreciate that framing. I realize that we haven't done intros, and I would love for each of you just to take maybe 30 seconds, go around the table and introduce yourselves so that the listeners have more context in your background. So maybe Chris, because you spoke last, do you want to go first?
Sure. And by the way, actually, if we want to bring Blaine up, he would also be able to speak to some of these things, since he was there to build these things. So my background, I came to Silicon Valley in 2004, and my first project was helping to launch Firefox. And that was largely because I believed in the web as an open publishing platform that didn't have gatekeepers, or shouldn't have the same kind of gatekeepers that media previously had. I then went to started a social browser company called Flock. And as we were trying to build a social browser, essentially a social network into the browser, it turned out that there just weren't APIs to enable that to happen on top of the decentralized web, because the web had been built for documents and not for people. So what about spinning up a number of standards and protocol initiatives, including protocols like OpenID and OAuth and portable contacts and activity streams and a bunch of others. And granted, a lot of these were also being worked on and had been started outside of that initiative and that effort, but nonetheless, saw the need for identity and syndicatable activities built upon existing formats like RSS and Atom to make that possible. That ended up turning into a job at Google, where I spent 3 years both on the developer platform team and then also as a UX designer on Google+. So I designed parts of the Google profile. And then I spent a number of years working at startups, and I built an AI company and raised some money. And now I actually am a product lead at a company called Republic, where we help people raise equity crowd financing for startups.
Thank you, Chris. Did you want to add something?
No.
Okay.
Or do we want to? If I'm supposed to popcorn to someone, Geoffrey.
No worries. I can manage that. I wanted to say I love your profile picture, NFT.
Oh, thank you. Fabulous.
And yeah, thank you for that context. And I guess you mentioned, you have experience building decentralized social media. What phase of your career was that? Which company?
It's funny, back in 2005 to 2007, I was largely on my own, working at my own little consulting company called Citizen Agency. And it was in there where we started a number of decentralized events called bar camps, where we organized a lot of people in the tech world to come together and to organize themselves. And that was set up as kind of like a decentralized, you might call it a DAO today, but we didn't have a blockchain, so I guess it wasn't a DAO. And then in 2006, opened the first co-working spaces in San Francisco and kind of popularized that model of getting people together on a more permanent basis, since Barcamp was more temporary, and then socialized that movement to bring those about. And then in 2007, as I mentioned, that was like when I wrote up the proposal for the hashtag and convinced people like Blaine, to support it, even though I think Blaine thought it was a stupid idea, like most of Twitter did at the time.
Amazing. Love it. The founder of hashtag. That must be good.
Sometimes weird. Yeah.
And yeah, Blaine or anyone else who would love to come up on stage, please request access. But I want to move on to Matt. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, sure thing. My name is Matt Bischoff. I'm one of the founders of Lickability. We're a small software agency, and we've built a lot of social networks in our day, mostly for mobile platforms. Before going full time on that, I was at Tumblr, so I have experience on the engineering side and the product management side there. And at Lickability, the most relevant context to today's discussion is that I led the design of the Mastodon iOS app.
That's amazing. I'm sure there's a lot of learnings from that you can share today. And Matt, am I mistaken? You've also built or designed House Party?
We worked with the folks at House Party as well in the early days, mostly on the engineering side of things. They had some great designers on their team.
Do you mind quickly just sharing what House Party is and how it compares to maybe Twitter Spaces?
Sure. Yeah, House Party was an early group video chat app. It had a resurgence of popularity during the pandemic. What was interesting about it, it's no longer available, but what was interesting about it was rather than this model of FaceTime where you're explicitly calling your friend and setting up a video call, House Party was more a drop-in type experience. So you would open the app, you'd see who of your friends were in the house, and then you'd immediately be able to be in a video call with them, and other friends could then join in as well. So it was a really social space, and a lot of younger teens and kids were super into it.
Got it. Thank you, Matt, for joining. Geoffrey, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me here. So I'm a graduate student at MIT, and my general research interest is finding ways to give individual people more agency over their computing experience. I think we've ended up with a lot of cases where basically corporations define what your digital environment is like, and I'm searching for ways to flip that. There's two particular projects that I think are relevant for this conversation. One is this project called Cambria that I worked on with the Ink and Switch Industrial Research Lab. And there, what we were focused on is how do you enable people to translate between data and different schemas across different apps, which I think there's a lot of rich stuff there that we can talk about. And the second area I'm really interested in is browser extensions. So in general, browser extensions provide this. It's not an entirely new client. It's tweaking existing clients, right? And I think that's a really powerful technique to explore too. In particular, I've developed a browser extension called Twemex, which is an extension for the Twitter web client that does a lot of neat stuff to sort of try to make Twitter a more interesting place to find cool ideas that are sort of deeper in the archives. So yeah, that's I think my relevant work in this area, and excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit more about the Twitter Chrome extension?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's certain parts of Twitter that I personally love. It's, finding this really interesting insight that someone came up with, or connecting with cool ideas. And there's other parts of it that I don't love as much. I really don't like the sort of news addiction aspects of it personally, even though keeping up with the news I think it's a valid thing. It's just not something I am trying to do. And so I wanted to nudge the Twitter experience more towards having these interesting conversations and ideas. So what Twemex does is it sort of replaces that news sidebar in the web client with a new sidebar that surfaces the most liked tweets from the past on people's profiles and gives you really easy access to advanced search through sort of shortcut keywords that let you more easily search through older Twitter content. So that's what Twemex does.
Sounds like Nancy may have dropped off.
No.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I had minimized the screen and I couldn't find the space, so I couldn't unmute myself. So that's a user experience problem right there. Thank you, Geoffrey. And yeah, definitely interested in the extension. I think what you mentioned around not everyone potentially wants to use Twitter as a news source and be addicted to it. I think I tweeted this a couple of days back where I did a poll where asking people how many people are addicted to Twitter. It was majority, like 70% are. So very interesting model that you've worked on. Rabo, I know you framed the conversation, but would love to get a quick intro and background.
Sure. I'm Rabo. I've been working on startups and sort of empowering users to create their own media for a long time. I helped start a social movement called Indie Media as part of the anti-globalization movement over 20 years ago, and was the, first employee and originally developer at Odeo, which is, of course, as we know, the company that pivoted into becoming Twitter. I didn't work really on Twitter, but I was around and I saw this shift from this really open platform, this thing that Blaine built where we could actually do federated Twitter, to a more centralized system. And so always wanted to build it out to be more decentralized. I worked at a bunch of different startups, spent a little bit of time at the Center for Civic Media at the MIT Media Lab, trying to understand what we're doing. And then 3 years ago, founded a company called Planetary, which builds a decentralized social media app on the secure Scuttlebutt protocol. So this stuff is all very near and dear to my heart. And yeah, that's a bit about myself. Oh, and the name Rabble comes from the fact that there was Evan Williams, myself, Evan, Henshaw-Plath, and Noah Glass as the three people getting together in a cafe in the very early days of Odeo. And so Evan Williams decided to go by Ev, which he'd used online, and I'd use Rabble occasionally for activist stuff. And so neither one of us used Evan, and so neither one of us got at Evan on Twitter.
That is such an interesting story. And I'm sure we can pull, both from your experience as an early employee at Twitter and your experience building Planetary in this conversation. So thank you. I guess like one quick question before we ask Patricia to introduce herself. What are your like initial, I guess, thoughts on Bluesky, or what's your vision for Bluesky?
So, I mean, Bluesky to me is an attempt to go back to, in 2007, 2008, Twitter was federated between Jaiku and Twitter using XMPP, and that didn't scale for technical reasons, and Twitter moved away from it for business reasons. And so Bluesky is a project which says, okay, the technology has come along a lot in the last 15 years. The platform is more stable. Everyone's not just running around trying to keep the servers online. Now, can we go back to that experiment? Can we take that path not taken? And can we say, what happens if this is a protocol? There was a Blaine who's here and listening, said that do we want to be a big fish in a small pond, or the only fish in a small pond, or a big fish in a big ocean? And the larger web and the internet is the big ocean. And so Bluesky is an attempt to sort of reconnect the pond that is Twitter, that is these sort of isolated social media ecosystems, into a larger ocean where people can interact back and forth. And it's an experiment. But I would say that it's one of many experiments going on right now where a lot of people are trying to figure it out. And a lot of people are saying, okay, what is it with distributed ledgers? What is it with the cryptography we have? And it really isn't just about the money. It isn't about a cryptocurrency, because many of these projects don't have cryptocurrencies or aren't entirely based on them, but more a saying that the underlying decentralization technology has come along so that we can build user-facing interfaces on top of it. And so that's super exciting. And I don't know that it will be so successful if we don't have some of the existing players come together. I joke that Twitter the decentralized projects, Reddit with their cryptocurrency decentralization initiative kind of represents a rebel alliance that we have Facebook, which has bought everybody up, and then we have everyone else who is trying to build a more open, unowned alternative. And learning from each other and collaborating is super important.
Thank you. I think I as a moderator, I feel like my job is easy because I have these amazing speakers with amazing background, but at the same time, in the next 30 minutes, I need to get through a lot of the content around decentralized user experience. So I'm excited. Patrícia, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, I'll be very brief, no worries. So I'm a UX designer and consultant. I've been focusing myself a lot on how I can merge design with security and user privacy. So that kind of led myself in a way to work a lot with cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. I've been around crypto for a while now. I think it's been a few years since I've met you, Manasi, and we were already there in crypto. And I've did some user research, mostly private, but I've been able to do a couple of pieces of public open source user research, which was one about the Lightning Network a few years ago, and one more recent about Bitcoin as a whole. Thanks very much to Square Crypto and their grants, who made it possible for me to work on that. And now I've been working as a contractor with Blockstream, and I've been working on things about the Liquid network. I've worked with in NFT projects, and well, that's it. I'm still around decentralization and how to make design work for this.
Yeah, and I remember meeting you, Patricia. That was like a few years ago, and you were coming in, in this technology space with a very user-centric mindset. So we definitely need that. And I know you ended up doing this research on Bitcoin's design and user experience. I guess let's start there. One, are there any learnings that are applicable in this context of like decentralized social media? And then two, are there core premises regarding user experience that we can all agree with? Like, this is where we want to start. Like, this is what the users need, and we want to keep that in mind as we build these platforms.
Okay, so let's start with the first. I think a good learning for that would apply also here for Bluesky is that when you are building for such a wide universe of users, which is basically essentially everyone, you have to admit that you can't really know all of your users. I mean, even with research, even with resources for research, you can only know so much about the people you are designing to. There will always be use cases that you never thought of. There will always be edge cases, and I mean, there are so many things that people will do with the technologies that we hadn't thought of in the beginning. And so I think the best way to think of a decentralized technology, given this limitation of UX research, is to think of the decentralized technology as like a strong but extensible core. So you have fundamental aspects that you can't give up, that you're gonna work on, but you are always gonna leave space for people to extend and to build upon it with their specific needs. I think that's the best way to cover as many use cases as possible, is to like leave space for creation on top of the core technology. Like just to give an example of what I'm talking about. So in Bitcoin, still one of the greatest pain points is the transition between fiat and crypto. It's like, how do you get from your fiat currency to Bitcoin? And I think the best solutions for this are usually the local solutions. Like if you are in Brazil, for example, it's where I come from. The most used solution for this is it depends on a system that only exists there. So basically, people were building on top of the core technology of Bitcoin with the specific needs that they have there. And so I think this would be like the most important thing that I could share from my user research, from my BTC research. Now, about the core premises, like I think core premises of user experience would always surround, in the case of decentralized technologies, of course, would always be surrounded by the need to empower the users so they will understand and make the best choices for them and for the ones around them. And I think all the core premises that we will create to design, like we want an interface to be simple and easy to use. Why do we want this? We want it to be simple and easy to use because we want the user to better understand the choices that they have and to better act upon them. So it is, in essence, a way to help them feel empowered by that decentralized technology. So the different clients that we would have in a decentralized technology, we would maybe want to work so that they will be able to coexist, to communicate between all the different clients, because we want to empower people to collaborate and to discuss and to learn from one another. So basically, everything that we decide that are core premises for design, I think that come from this core of empowering the user. I think that it may make myself clear.
Yeah, no, thank you for walking us through, like, things simple from a user experience perspective. I think another thing that I think about a lot is, like, I really don't want millions of apps for doing the same thing. Like, I don't want 10 different messaging apps, which is the case right now. I don't want 10 different video sharing apps. And that's kind of a user friction at the moment.
Yeah.
And then to connect with friends, regardless of, like, if they're using a different platform or protocol or application, can I still interact with them and not feel like, I have to go through either like downloading their app that they're on, or it's not really a seamless user experience. So that makes sense. Anyone else on the panel wanting to add to the core premise?
Yeah, I'll just respond to that last point you made, because I think it's a really good point, and it's something that I find myself struggling with as well. Like when we're, as technologists and as product people, building another messaging app, another social network, another mail app, and users end up with 20 of each of these things on their phones. None of them are interoperable. I think being at companies and working with clients that have contributed to this explosion of networks and clients. One of the reasons for that is the thing that Rabel brought up earlier, which is like business reasons, right? And there are always going to be business incentives to create a new platform rather than building on top of an existing one, because you can capture more of the value in that network. And so I think part of the problem with this, and why this interoperability has never quite taken off in this space the way that it has been promised for decades at this point, is those incentives. And so until we address those incentives, the user experience is always kind of going to lag behind that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the incentives and just having these silos has been profitable and the best business model so far. And that's why we've seen, new platforms kind of just restrict that user flow and attention within those platforms. How does that change in a decentralized world? Like what changes? I know, Matt, I think you mentioned regulation changing in EU, forcing companies to be more interoperable around the messaging side of things. But I'm curious, what benefits decentralized social media can bring in this context.
Yeah, I think that was Chris actually, but I'll speak to it a little bit, and then someone else can jump in. I think the biggest benefit is being able to build applications that let you connect with everyone that you care about and follow topics that you care about, or communicate with anyone that you care about, regardless of having to have that moment of, wait, this is my friend that uses Facebook Messenger. This is my friend that uses WhatsApp. This person I'm following on Twitter. This person I'm following on Instagram. Computers are incredibly powerful and should have the ability to synthesize all of that information. We've just decided to lock down our APIs and our interoperability, partially for technical reasons. Also, as Rabel pointed out, when these platforms were growing really, really quickly, it was technically impossible to keep up with federating them. But now that it is possible, I think that the biggest benefit is that one place for one type of activity type of thing.
Yeah.
One thing, sorry, to bring up in this context, and I think it's good, I suppose, that now we're getting into some of these higher level points about competition and incentives and market dynamics. Of course, we haven't specifically labeled out advertising and where that goes in the world of decentralization. I'm not convinced that it'll either go away or get any better, and in fact, it might get worse. But there is this question that maybe the way that I think about competition, that's like a healthy competition, and I sort of alluded to this before, is in sports ball. I don't know, I'm not really into like sports that much. However, I think that the design of sports leagues is a useful metaphor for the type of competition that is useful. So in the game of, let's say, baseball, for example, there is a certain set of rules, and those rules are like protocols that define how people actually participate and how they will compete. So for example, I can't, come into a baseball game with a bat that's like 2 feet around, because that would give me an unfair advantage. And so there are rules that say, well, you have to do it this way or that way. And yet, nonetheless, there is and has been innovation in these games over the years and how people play the sports. So part of the role of, if it's a regulation or what's going on in the EU, for example, demanding interoperability between these platforms, should be to essentially create some set of standards that allows for interoperability of the essential services or the essential messaging bus or something that allows things to move between different silos. And then upon arriving at those silos, those messages can then be enhanced or improved based on the payloads and how those payloads are specified. Now, I realize it's very high level and abstract, but I guess I want to point to the need for competitiveness in clients and how clients render and improve and enhance the user experience, as opposed to causing stagnation because a protocol is either like too restrictive or, I guess to put the other way, not generative enough. Generativity is a type of attribute that you want to design into formats and technologies that allow people to take an existing technology and to build upon it and expand it into novel or unanticipated by the creators outputs. I guess I'll speak to one specific example of this. When I was working on Google+, there was a battle inside about whether or not the platform should support hashtags. And of course, I was an advocate for them supporting hashtags, but also as someone who cared about decentralization, there was a move internally by a set of engineers that wanted to create essentially non-interoperable hashtags, where they wanted to innovate, quote unquote, on the format because they thought that hashtags look stupid in camel case or as long strings. So they wanted you to be able to have sentence-long hashtags where you had spaces in the hashtags, and the way that you would denote the end of a hashtag was by putting another pound symbol at the end of your phrase. Well, that's all nice and fine, if you're Google, and you're dominant and doing stupid shit. But in this case, I felt like that was non-interoperable and would actually break the ability for, let's say, third-party or smaller providers that were aggregating hashtags from across the web and across different networks from having one standard way for people to express themselves using that behavioral technology. Ultimately, I won that battle, but it's sort of an example where you have to be really thoughtful and mindful about how you choose to innovate, what you choose to innovate on, and whether you're choosing to innovate based on actually wanting to compete at a higher level, or if you just want to be annoying and break everything, because of how big you are.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Those are great points, Chris.
Yeah. Rabble seems to have a point.
The business model stuff that we were talking about is important. It wasn't publicly stated, but the reason the Twitter board under Dick Costello shut down third-party apps was because it was, this comes from Ryan Sarver, who was in charge of the platform at the time, is that there was no way to verify how third-party apps were running ads. And so the feeling was, in order to make the business model work, the open experience around apps wouldn't work. And I think that, in some ways, crypto can be a Ponzi scheme, but it also can give us a model for how we can solve the business model monetization issue in a way that wasn't solvable before. One of the things that come up when we talk about unifying all these identities and unifying these different platforms, and this is something that we at Planetary did a bunch of user research on, was that the social space of why you're using one platform and another is orthogonal to the technology itself. So we found people who, the traditional one is people use Facebook because it connects you to old friends and because the groups work really well. They use Twitter to talk about culture and politics. They use Instagram to, again, do culture and also political organizing. But one of the things that was super interesting was, there was one person who was like, they used LinkedIn as their primary social platform for keeping in touch with friends. And often people are choosing different platforms and then curating a list of friends on that platform based on different identities for themselves, because we're not all the same people to different communities. And so as we design a decentralized future or a decentralized platform, we have to realize that users need many identities, and it's not just a single phone number or a single set of identifiers. It's why there's all these businesses around providing fake forwarding phone numbers to people using dating apps. It's because you don't want your phone number in someone else's address book that then starts suggesting things in Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and everywhere else because you talked about going on one Tinder date with them. And because we don't have any other connection to social graph and sort of the phone number database is this shared thing, that we overload it with a ton of information, and there's a huge privacy problem. On the other hand, it's the only one that's not owned by something. And so I think we need to realize and how to design systems that say, okay, we have different aspects of ourselves and we don't always want to share them. We don't want to collapse them. We want to be able to maintain your work personality versus, Burning Man versus art versus politics. And you need to be able to keep those things separate. And on existing platforms like Twitter and Instagram, I've found that over the last couple of years, I've had just a proliferation of accounts in order to keep those separate. But I think we need to design a better solution.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I just want to jump in on that because this is like a real area of passion for me, because I've always, in sort of very long, understood and believed in the value of identity in social platforms. And I completely also agree that what Rabble is saying is something that probably was a blind spot for me earlier on. I think, because I did a lot of work on OpenID and a lot of, UI work back then. There was, I think, a very privileged white male view of identity that was really narrow. And it turns out, even as a white male, now that I have those same needs and desires for sharding my identity into different facets in different contexts, because that is actually how we act and behave. The research at Google that led into Google Plus's circles actually came to the same conclusion, that people are actually quite intentional about how they represent themselves in different spaces and digital environments, and that providing signifiers to people who are entering into a new space is very important as to the type of space that they're entering into. For example, when you enter into LinkedIn, you'd kind of expect that you should have, sort of a suit and tie on or something along those lines, or something that's more proper. Whereas, in a place like Tumblr or less Instagram now. Instagram's more confusing, but like TikTok, it's more playful or more casual, etc. And so the UI and the design of those spaces stylistically informs the way in which you might present yourself. And deviating from some of those norms can actually cause you to stand out more than you might otherwise prefer. But it is interesting, and I think, Rabel, to your point, to your research, that more and more apps are starting to, I think, both recognize and design for a plurality of sharded accounts within the same sort of master account. And certainly Instagram has moved in that direction by kind of implicitly supporting Finstas, which is more behavior than a technology, but regardless, and the ability to fast user switch in apps like Twitter and elsewhere is something that didn't exist before. It was sort of one account per person, and that was largely to defeat spam. But as people have set up multiple accounts, whether it's for business and work or for personal lives, or just because they have their parent-facing account and then their friend-facing account, it's becoming more normalized and more interfaces exist, and users are willing to I think deal with that complexity because the benefits are so important from a sociological perspective. And so this is a really good example where centralized technologies and solutions could be leading the way in terms of the patterns that then can enable decentralized solutions to adopt them to support what people actually want.
Yeah. Geoffrey, I see you want to chime in. I just want to quickly say I 100% agree in terms of like each social platform, we might want to have a separate identity of the way we present ourselves. But again, going back to the lowest common denominator, right? I do not want to log in or create accounts in each social platforms. Like my name or my email ID or like the basic information doesn't need to be created or re-entered every time. And if there are building blocks that help us use that kind of core component of identity while also letting us customize across social platforms, I think that's going to be a better user experience. But Geoffrey, jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to loop back to something that Chris said earlier that I think is really important, which is around this tension between interop and innovation. And I feel that it's important to acknowledge that there is a real tension there. Maybe that hashtag example was sort of a little silly because it's not clear that the value of that innovation was particularly great, and maybe you could frame it as mainly just a selfish building a moat. But I do think it's true that interop can sort of apply this drag force to innovation, right? It does make it harder to do new stuff, and I think in order to get people excited about building decentralized experiences, I feel like that it's really important to acknowledge that tension and to build foundations that make it easier to have partial compatibility, graceful degradation, to allow things to be allow protocols to be really easily extended for particular clients or sets of clients seems like a critical feature to me. I know a few people who've built email clients, and it's sort of a huge sort of set of walls around what they're able to do, right? You want to add emoji reactions to email, and it's not clear how you go about that. And so I'm just curious what you, Chris, and others here think about that, managing that tension.
I guess I'll just jump in quickly. I mean, it's a super hard problem, and it's one of those things where it is important to sort of, this may sound controversial, but to behave like Facebook and essentially observe how people are using a product or a platform, and to then build those features in over time. The problem, though, to your point, is how do you actually design or support interoperability, between platforms? It's been actually fascinating, and I don't know how we would get these people to come, share their knowledge with us, but to have observed how the Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook messaging backends have been gradually replaced over the last 3 to 4 years with one sort of super straight of the Messenger backend. The Messenger backend basically enabled this bot explosion in 2016. And ultimately, messaging on Instagram and WhatsApp have been replaced with one unified set of infrastructures. And recently, for example, individual Instagram style message reactions are coming to WhatsApp because it's all on the same backend. It's the same protocol. Now that can happen on a centralized platform, but it's much harder to do in a decentralized way. And I'd actually love to hear from Matt on how he approached this with Mastodon, because while there is a protocol and it uses some of the formats and standards that we came up with in the 2006 and 7 time period, nonetheless, some of those protocols like ActivityPub anticipated that people would create new types of verbs and new types of nouns and new types of actions and activities that former clients or clients that, let's say, were stuck in Amber and didn't change would be unable to display. Now, actually, as I'm saying that, I'm reminded that there are a lot of apps today that require you to update in order to continue to use them. And I think that includes Instagram and Facebook and others. So there is kind of a force function where previously the idea was that, this is my software. I either bought it or I downloaded it. I don't want to fuck with it. I don't want to upgrade to like the new latest thing because I like it the way it is and don't move my cheese. And as we move to a world of web services, that assumption no longer holds. Now, software is a lot more like the web, and someone on a remote server kind of makes an update, and you have to update your client if you want to continue to use the software. So there is actually a mechanic in place that enforces end users to have to update their software, whether they want to or not, in order to stay up to date and to get that interoperability. So that, I guess I'd be very curious about that dynamic. And, Matt, in your experience on Mastodon, whether or not that was something that was principally embraced or something that you found was challenging as you wanted to innovate and create more user-facing benefits and features, but had people that just refused to update, and therefore we would sort of break the experience.
Having some technical issues. I only heard part of that. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I thought the issue was on my end, but did we all?
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Did you
okay, so it must have been Chris.
Okay.
Damn.
But I think the question was about Mastodon and about
innovation.
Innovation. Yeah. This the client thing that you mentioned specifically, like forcing clients to update, is a tool that we've used, and it is a tool that I think is really useful in these types of conversations, because you'll always want to add not just new types of posts, but new ways to interact with posts, new ways to promote posts. And so if you're designing a federated network where some servers, like in Mastodon's case, some servers might have certain features enabled, some servers might not have those features enabled, that can become really important, right? Of like, okay, if these two servers are interoperating, how do we want to signal that to the user? And there are some cases in the mobile app where that comes up.
I just wanted to bring up, this is where my work on the Cambria project is super relevant. And basically what we observed is it's really hard to build software if you might be dealing with a bunch of different clients on older versions or entirely different apps, right? And the core problem is, how do you reason about what the behavior of an application when you don't know what data is there or not, that sort of thing. And this comes up even in centralized cloud services where, a lot of public APIs will sort of put pressure on clients to upgrade. And eventually they might deprecate an old version of the API. And that's just because it's a huge pain to support really old versions in your current code, right? And so the idea with Cambria is, can you insert a layer in between your code and the outside world and have these translators that translate sort of unknown, old, or different data into the data that you want to use in your current version of the app that you're thinking in or using. And those translators can be sort of decoupled from the app logic itself. So maybe you as a client developer write those translations. Maybe other people contribute those translations in a decentralized way to build bridges across existing apps. But the basic thesis is that if you have better tech around sort of mediating data translations, maybe that can make it easier to actually build this kind of software. Because I think we do have to acknowledge, if it's really, really hard for devs, it's much less likely to happen, even if it's sort of even if people know it's the right thing. And so I'm very interested in that sort of space of tools for making this stuff actually easier to build.
All of the ink and switch stuff is super important for the space, and I don't think we promote it enough, and we don't talk about the way in which ink and switch and its network of people are really developing a bunch of the core work and documenting it to make this stuff work. They're kind of the hidden, think tank behind all this tech, and I think it's important that we highlight them more.
I'm curious, Geoffrey, that data translation layer that you mentioned, how does that impact the end user experience? If, a particular image in one application has a certain format and standard, how does it help with rendering in other applications, or even like notifications across multiple applications? And I know, Robert, we are at time, but if you don't mind continuing this conversation for a little bit before we jump into Q&A.
Please go ahead, and also we can see if Blaine would like to give some thoughts if he's still here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can speak to that question a bit. I think there's sort of two questions here. One is, what is like physically possible as a design, right? So there are just some limits on, if you have two clients and they have different UIs, there's a limit to how well you're going to be able to communicate across them, and sometimes there's not really any perfect solution. As one example, right? If you we built a to-do list app using Cambria, and in one app you can assign one person to a task. In another app you can assign many people to a task. And so on the one side of it, you can only see one of the people who's assigned. That's just a limit of that user interface. And what Cambria allowed us to do was to create the best possible compatibility bridge across and really ergonomically express that compatibility logic. But there's a separate question of, a designer has to sit there and think about what's going to best, express this data across UIs. So I honestly think that there's really tricky design challenges there. But even just making it possible to express the best possible compatibility bridge in code is itself a difficult technical challenge. And so those are sort of the two parts of it.
Yeah, Rabo, Patricia, any thoughts there in terms of interoperability, especially as we move into a world of multiple clients, how the rendering works, or even notification works? Or any thoughts there?
I mean, so I would say that the best example of interoperability that we have at the moment is the work that the Matrix project is doing, where they support a mix of federated or end-to-end peer-to-peer systems, but also a very clear API on how you integrate and how you sort of bridge between systems. And I think we need more of that. I think we need more documentation on what bridges would look like and how they work. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. We've had everyone, like, a consistent request for people in Scuttlebutt is that we enable interoperability with ActivityPub, Activity Streams, and the Fediverse. But the problem is that there's a mismatch in the underlying technologies. One is a gossip protocol where the ability to speak is driven by cryptographic keys, and the other is a federated protocol where everything's controlled by servers, and there isn't that kind of verification of posts. And so we haven't, we've got lots of prototypes, but we haven't figured out how to bridge these systems because they're designed differently. And I don't think that we'll be able to bridge everything. The Cambria stuff and the way in which those transforms work in terms of mapping the data is a great first step. But I think that each one of these from one system to the other is going to need to be individually designed. But we hopefully can extract some patterns.
Yeah, and I think then it goes into the question of standards and who should be designing those standards, and do we need another standard? Um, Robert, do you want to do you mind
Please keep going for a little while longer, and if people have questions, please do request to speak, and we've put up a little question format. Keep it about 1 minute if you can, and introduce yourself, etc. So please go on for a few more minutes, and then we'll start Q&A. And we'll also ask Mastodon to speak if you'd like.
Thank you, Robert. I know this has been such an interesting conversation. I think we can go on for multiple hours, but thank you for giving us a few more minutes. Patricia, did you want to chime in? I saw you.
Yeah, no, I just a quick comment to add on this about interoperability and things like this. I think we need just to have in mind that since if we have that approach of multiple clients, that in each client will be tackling different use cases, I think that is natural that we expect that different clients will have different priorities in terms of main user actions and things like this. So this is a place that I'd like to bring up a quote from a senior colleague of mine that from a few years ago that told me something I never forgot, which is coherence is better than consistency. And basically what we mean here is that it is more important that
Sorry, is
the
Patricia
different...
up for everyone or just me?
Yeah, she's breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you mind repeating the quote, Patricia?
Do you mind what? Sorry? Repeating.
The quote that you were reading?
Oh, yeah, of course. Which is coherence is better than consistency. So in design, what it was meant by this, it was that instead of focusing on having everything done the same across interfaces, it was more important that those interfaces made sense in their specific context and in the user context. So even if clients are different because they have different priorities, I think the important thing is that we can have something underlying that speaks the same language, because it needs to have this interoperability factor. But it's important to think that each user will have a different context and a different use case. And so therefore, I mean, it's natural that there will be differences across that we have to deal with.
Thank you, Patricia.